Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It's the 2nd of October and a decent number of updates this week. As always, the updates are in the description below so you can jump to any particular one. New videos this week. So I quickly created a new video on, hey, if you want to get the new Windows 11 22H2 and you're not being offered it, a very simple way so you can force the download. Then I created a video diving into the new networking options around the Azure Kubernetes service, both in terms of interacting with the control plane, but also how I can think about the pod networking and how the pods that host the containers get their IP addresses. And then another super quick video on, hey, if you copy a managed disk from one subscription to another subscription, even another tenant, how I can then create a VM from that copied disk. It's a little 2-minute video. On to what's new. So talking of disks, unmanaged disks, i.e. those old disks we used to have to think about page blobs and storage accounts and storage account limits, they're all retiring end of September 2025. So you've got a couple of years, but you want to get to managed disks. App service backup and restore is in GA. So the whole point of this is there's an automatic backup capability for basic, standard, premium app service plans that gives you this hourly 30-day retention. So it's hourly for the first, I think, 3 days. Then it keeps every 3 hours for the next 11 days. Then there's this 6 hourly for the last 16 days. Or for basic, standard, premium, and isolated, I can do a custom plan. So then I can set my own schedule. I can do a backup now. And then when I restore, I can restore over an app or just to a completely new app, new deployment slot. So that's all GA. ACE V2 and V3 have automatic backup in preview. So remember, app service environment is that ability to, instead of having that multi-tenant aspects of an app service plan, I have a completely single tenant deployed into my virtual network. And then I create app service plans in that dedicated complete set of infrastructure. So now that has that automatic backup available for me as well. Azure Functions .NET in isolated mode is GA. Isolated, remember, is that ability that it runs the process, that worker process, in an isolated manner. And what that means is that process is no longer tied to the underlying OS that's hosting the process. Because when it's tied, I have to have the same versions of frameworks. If it's isolated out, it removes those dependencies from the underlying OS. So now I can use different versions of things like .NET in that isolated process compared to what that underlying host OS is running. Azure Functions has Java 17 in preview. And Azure Functions Linux Elastic Premium has some new max scale out limits. So when I think about the whole point of this Elastic is it's dynamic. And the premium aspect means they're pre-warmed up. So I get a certain set of basically hosting elements for my functions. And the Elastic means they scale. They scale in and out. But they are dedicated, they're pre-warmed up, and now they just have increased this number of limits, which is really just the big thing around this. So it does vary by region. You can kind of see all these new limits. And it's really those Linux, as I said, it's the Linux Elastic Premium that have increased. So you can see on this right-hand side here, this has gone up in a large number of the regions, what that max Elastic scale can now be. So that's really the big change there. Moving on the networking side, so the basic free load balancer is being retired that end of September 2025 as well. So I would need to move to the standard load balancer. So that is a paid component, the standard offering. But that standard offering gives me better performance. It gets me an SLA. Obviously, there's no SLA with free components. I have a secure by default load balancer, and I have to open things up with NSGs, whereas basic is just open by default. I get better metrics. There are steps to migrate. There are scripts I can use to do this migration. Remember, if I'm using a public load balancer, the public IP has to match the same tier as the load balancer. So if I'm moving from a basic load balancer to a standard load balancer, well, that basic public IP has to move to a standard public IP as well. So the scripts take care of all of that. And there are scripts for internal load balancers as well. ExpressRoute fastpath for VNet peering and user-defined routes has gone GA. When we think of ExpressRoute private peering, ingress traffic comes in via our ExpressRoute gateways. Egress never goes via the gateway. That goes directly to the Microsoft Enterprise Edge, the MSEE. But what fastpath does is for that traffic ingressing, it doesn't go via the gateways. It goes directly to the target virtual machines, the target services. Well, now with fastpath for VNet peering, if that target service is now in a peered virtual network, it can still bypass the gateway. And with the UDR support, if I put a user-defined route on that gateway subnet, that will now still be honored and would maybe send the traffic as the next hop to some network virtual appliance, maybe Azure Firewall. So that is all GA. And Azure Firewall now has this policy analytics in preview. If we think about our Azure Firewall, over time, we tend to add new network rules, new application rules, maybe daily. So these rules start to mount up. And if I get too many, it can start to negatively impact the performance, the functioning of our Azure Firewall. So what Policy Analytics does is it gives us insight into, hey, well, which of these rules are affecting which flows of traffic? I can look at the detail of a particular rule and see what's actually happening. I can see things like rule hit rates. And the whole point of this will then allow me to go and optimize my rules, maybe delete some that aren't being used anymore to keep my firewall operating at an optimal level. On the storage side, so Azure NetApp Files has some new regions and new pairs. Remember, this is the NetApp filer-based native Azure solutions. There's NetApp filers actually in the Azure data centers. So they've added now Korea South and Sweden Central, but also they have pairings of what I can do replication. Now, some of those pairings are the regular Azure paired regions, but they also have a lot of additional pairings beyond the Azure standard. So they now have Korea Central to Korea South, North Central US to East US 2, and France Central to West Europe. Azure Policy now supports Azure NetApp Files, and I think it's 4 policies they've created. And they're really policies around the idea of, hey, if you're using NFS, you have to use not v3, i.e. you have to use 4.1. If you're using 4.1, well, maybe you have to use Kerberos data encryption. Maybe I have to use Kerberos integrity as an option, or privacy, which actually encrypts the client traffic. So there's policies around that. There's policies around SMB3, hey, must use encryptions. Now, if I go to just Azure Policy and search for NetApp, you'll see those 4 policies, and I can turn those on to now enforce, hey, I don't want to use NFS 3, and hey, when I am using NFS 4.1, I have to have encryption on it. So I can now set that with native Azure policies. On the database side, version 11 of Postgres will be retiring for both single and flexible, 9th of November 2024. Azure SQL Database now has a 128 vCore option. So this is 128 virtual cores, 625 gigabytes of memory, and this is available for both general purpose, business critical, and elastic pools. So this replaces the old highest limit of 80 vCores and 415 gigabytes of memory. So I can just get some really, really huge Azure SQL databases in there. Azure AD authentication for MySQL Flexible. Remember, Flexible is the new model we're moving to for those open source managed databases for MySQL and Postgres. It's based on VMs. I can have native automatic HA. I have availability zone support. I have a lot more configuration. I can use burstable VMs. I can stop and start them. Well, with MySQL Flexible, now I can use Azure AD-based authentication. So I can give those Azure AD users and groups roles on that MySQL, and that includes managed identities. So my other resources running in Azure can now just natively authenticate and get permissions to MySQL without having to worry about any kind of security principle that I have to store somewhere. PostgreSQL Flexible, backup restore cross-region has gone GA. So during creation, I have to set this during creation, but during creation, I can elect to set my backup as geo-redundant. And what that will do is it will use GRS instead of the normal ZRS or LRS for those backups, which would just be in region. And then that would let me restore to the paired region. So that option is now GA. Azure SQL Hyperscale, remember hyperscale is that hugely performant, hugely scalable Azure SQL offering, which has separate page servers with their own storage, which then go and talk to that primary compute node, but there are secondaries as well. Well, now I can retain up to 10 years, which is much longer than a typical 1 to 35 day retention I can configure. It's been available for the other SQL offerings for quite a long time, that long-term retention, but now, hey, it's coming to hyperscale as well. And what this is really doing is it's taking those snapshots and it's copying them to separate blob storage. And then I can configure, hey, I want to keep weeklies for this amount of time, monthlies for this amount of time, and an annual for this amount of time. So I have a lot of granularity in, hey, what do I actually want that retention to look like? Azure SQL Hyperscale now has a migration to general purpose. So if I was running on another tier of Azure SQL database, I could migrate to Hyperscale. Well, now, and there are some caveats around this, I can migrate to general purpose. Now, it's only to general purpose, not the other types. It has to be within 45 days of the original migration to hyperscale. And so it has to have been a migration to hyperscale. So if it was a fresh hyperscale install, I can't do that migration to general purpose. So I was on another tier, I migrated to hyperscale, and I've changed my mind. And within 45 days, I can change my mind and I can migrate, but I have to migrate to general purpose. So that is now in G8. It is a data move operation. Now that data copy will happen while it's running, but then there will, I think, be a couple of minutes of downtime when you actually do that final switch. So there'll be a little bit of impact to that. Azure SQL Managed Instance now has a gzrs backup option. So this is where, hey, I have the 3 primary copies spread over AZs and then asynchronously copied to the paired region where there's another 3 copies. And Azure SQL MI also has a new memory optimized hardware generation. And this is actually pretty cool. We'll look at this quickly. So if we were to go and create a SQL managed instance, obviously there's different tiers and types available to us. But if I just go and look at configure the sizing, and if I pick business critical, you notice we have these 3 options. Hey, standard series, premium series, and premium series memory optimized. And it's this new memory optimized we're focused on. Now this is using the new 3rd gen Ice Lake. I get 13.6 gigabytes of RAM per core. But what's interesting, if I looked at standard and I went as big as I can, well, my biggest database is 4 terabytes. If I went premium series, hey, it goes up to 5.5. But now with this premium series memory optimized, I can actually go up all the way to 16 terabytes. So I get a much bigger potential database as well. So that's one of the, now a nice option. Not only do I get this memory optimized hardware, but I can also get a much, much bigger database. Miscellaneous. If I am using Azure Monitor Logs, now you're going to start archive tier, you're going to start paying for it. So the whole point now is Azure Monitor Logs really has 3 types of storage. There's the analytical logs, which I have the most power, the most KQL. I can really do everything, but I pay the most. Then there's those basic logs that restrict the KQL. I can't do cross-table queries. It's only there for 8 days. And then my total retention beyond whatever that analytical or basic can go to archive, where I have to do a search job or restore and bring it into analytical to actually use it. When that archive is super cheap and I can keep it for a really long time. Well, now if I am using that archive tier, the billing is going to start. And that was it. Next week's Azure update will be from a different location. So we're traveling things. But until then, I hope you take care and I'll see you in the next video.